Everyone laughed when a young woman inherited a worthless radio station for just $1. Even her own stepmother believed she had won, convinced she had gotten rid of the last piece of her late husband's legacy. But what no one knew was that hidden behind the crumbling walls of that abandoned radio station was a secret so powerful it could bring an entire town to tears, expose years of greed, and prove that some inheritances are worth far more than millions of dollars. In the next few minutes, you'll discover why hundreds of forgotten voices were hidden for decades, and why one brave daughter risked everything to protect them. If you skip this story, you'll miss one of the most unforgettable endings about family legacy and love you'll ever hear. Part 1, Introduction, Character and Setting. At just 23 years old, Evelyn Harper believed she had already endured the worst life could possibly offer. She had buried her father, watched strangers pack away every memory of her childhood, and stood silently as the only home she had ever known slipped into someone else's hands. But she had no idea that the greatest secret her father ever protected was still waiting for her, hidden where no one had thought to look. Everyone in town believed the abandoned radio station on the edge of the marsh was nothing more than a decaying shell. Its windows were broken, its tower rusted, and its silence had lasted so long that people barely remembered it had ever been alive. To developers, it was worthless land. To her calculating stepmother, it was an embarrassing reminder of a man she wanted everyone to forget. She sold it to Evelyn for a single dollar, smiling as though she had won the final battle. She was wrong. What looked like a cruel joke would soon become the discovery that changed an entire town forever. As Evelyn wrapped her fingers around the cold, rusted key, she remembered something her father used to whisper whenever he repaired old vacuum tubes late into the night. "The most important signals are the ones nobody else can hear." At the time, she thought he was talking about radio waves. He wasn't. Within the crumbling walls of that forgotten station rested a secret so extraordinary that powerful people were willing to erase an entire legacy just to keep it buried. It wasn't money. It wasn't gold. It was something infinitely more valuable, something capable of exposing lies, healing old wounds, and forcing an entire community to confront a past they believed had vanished forever. The countdown had already begun. Developers were preparing to demolish the building within weeks. Every passing day brought the wrecking crews closer. If Evelyn failed to uncover what her father had left behind before the walls came down, decades of history would disappear forever, along with the voices that had been waiting all this time for someone brave enough to listen. She thought she had inherited a forgotten ruin. In reality, she had inherited a miracle. And once the first hidden door opened, there would be no turning back. The first time Evelyn unlocked the station, every instinct told her to turn around. The heavy steel door groaned as if it had been waiting years for someone to return. A wave of stale air rushed past her, carrying the scent of dust, damp wood, aging electronics, and memories that refused to fade. Thin rays of sunlight slipped through cracked windows, revealing thousands of tiny particles drifting through the silence like forgotten stories, searching for someone willing to hear them again. Everything inside remained exactly as her father had left it. The massive broadcast console still stood proudly in the center of the room. Dust covered every switch and dial, yet nothing appeared abandoned. A stained coffee mug rested beside an open engineering manual. A pair of reading glasses lay across handwritten notes filled with calculations only Silas could understand. It looked less like a workplace frozen in time, and more like someone had stepped outside for a moment, fully expecting to return. Evelyn slowly walked toward the console. Her fingers trembled as they brushed across its metal surface, leaving a single clean line through years of accumulated dust. She swallowed hard. "I'm here, Dad." Her voice echoed through the empty building. Then, silence. Or at least, that's what she believed. A faint scratching noise broke the stillness. She spun around. Two bright green eyes stared back at her from beneath the console. For a brief second, her heart nearly stopped. A thin gray cat cautiously stepped into the light. One ear had been torn long ago, and its fur showed the wear of countless seasons spent surviving alone. Yet the moment it saw Evelyn, it walked straight toward her. Without fear, without hesitation, it rubbed gently against her leg and began to purr. A flood of memories rushed back. Static. Her father had rescued the stray years earlier. Neighbors constantly suggested taking the cat to a shelter, but Silas always smiled and shook his head. No, he would say. He belongs here. As Evelyn knelt to stroke the cat's head, tears filled her eyes. Everyone else had abandoned the station. Static never had. Somehow, he had stayed, almost as if he had been waiting for her. The days that followed settled into a quiet routine. Every morning before sunrise, Evelyn returned with cleaning supplies, work gloves, and a determination she couldn't explain. She washed windows no one had looked through in years. She dusted shelves filled with thousands of forgotten vinyl records. She organized decades of maintenance logs, engineering notebooks, repair manuals, and handwritten broadcast schedules. The more she cleaned, the less abandoned the station seemed. It wasn't dead. It was simply waiting. Every drawer she opened revealed another piece of her father's life. Every handwritten note reminded her that this building had never been just a business. It had been his purpose. Almost every afternoon, Arthur Benson arrived carrying a thermos of coffee and a paper bag holding 2 sandwiches. Arthur had owned the town's electronics repair shop for over 40 years and had been Silas's closest friend. Unlike everyone else, he never laughed at the old station. Instead, he walked through the building with quiet respect, running his fingers across equipment most people considered worthless. One afternoon, he stopped beside the towering transmitter. "You know," he said softly, "people thought your father spent all these years trying to keep an old radio station alive." He smiled sadly, but that was never what he was really doing. Evelyn looked up. "What do you mean?" Arthur hesitated before answering. "There were things even he wouldn't explain to me." He rested a hand on the transmitter. "Every Tuesday night he'd lock every door, send me home, and stay here until sunrise." "What was he doing?" Arthur chuckled. "I asked him that once." "What did he say?" Arthur looked toward the ceiling, remembering. He smiled and told me, "I'm listening to people who haven't spoken in years." Evelyn frowned. "That doesn't even make sense." Arthur nodded. "I know." He paused before adding quietly, "But your father believed memories never truly disappear. He used to say every story leaves behind an echo." The words lingered in Evelyn's mind long after Arthur left. An echo. She couldn't stop thinking about it. That evening, the station felt different. Rain tapped softly against the windows, while the wind rolled across the marsh outside, causing the old building to creak in long, slow sighs. Static wandered silently through the control room before disappearing behind the massive transmitter. A moment later, the cat meowed. Once, then again, more insistently. It wasn't asking for food. It wanted her attention. Curious, Evelyn followed? Static sat perfectly still, staring at one specific spot on the floor. She knelt beside him. The instant her hand touched the concrete, she froze. It was warm. Not slightly warm. Noticeably warm. She quickly placed her other hand on the surrounding floor. Cold. Ice cold. Only that single patch held heat. Her pulse quickened. That couldn't be possible. The station had been without electricity for years. Yet the warmth was real. Static calmly curled into a ball directly on top of the heated spot and began purring louder than before. Almost. like a guard protecting something precious. Evelyn slowly stood and examined the wall behind the transmitter. Something suddenly felt wrong. Not dangerous. Different. The baseboard wasn't the same color as the rest of the room. The paint looked newer. The wall texture was smoother. Even the nails appeared different. Her father had always been obsessively precise. Nothing inside this station happened by accident. Every cable had been labeled. Every drawer carefully organized. Every repair documented. If this section looked different, there had to be a reason. She spent the next several hours searching every filing cabinet in the building. Just before midnight, she finally uncovered stacks of old broadcast logs. At first they looked ordinary. Playlists, weather reports, maintenance schedules, broadcast times. But as she continued reading, strange entries began appearing between the normal records. E17, Delta 4, Archive B9, Signal 7. No explanations, no descriptions, only mysterious codes repeated over and over across nearly 2 decades. Her heartbeat accelerated. She compared those coded entries with the maintenance records. A chilling pattern emerged. Every coded broadcast occurred on nights when the transmitter consumed enormous amounts of electricity. Yet according to every official record, no radio programs had been broadcast. No listeners. No scheduled shows. Nothing. So where had all that power gone? And why had her father hidden it so carefully? The questions multiplied faster than the answers. Unable to ignore her instincts any longer, Evelyn returned to the transmitter. Static remained exactly where she had left him. Watching. Waiting. Outside, thunder rumbled across the marsh. Inside, the station seemed almost alive. She knelt beside the wall once again and tapped lightly along the baseboard. Solid. 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 Then, a hollow sound. She tapped again. There it was. An empty space hidden behind the wall. Every instinct warned her to stop. If she broke through that wall, there would be no turning back. Whatever her father had hidden had remained untouched for years. Perhaps it had been meant to stay that way. But another thought immediately pushed away her fear. The demolition crews were coming. Developers were counting the days until this building became nothing more than a pile of rubble. If she walked away now, whatever secret her father had spent a lifetime protecting would disappear forever. Evelyn closed her eyes, took one slow, steady breath, then reached for her father's old toolbox. She didn't know exactly what waited behind that wall, but deep inside, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. By tomorrow, everything she believed about her father and about the forgotten radio station everyone had dismissed as worthless was about to change forever. Evelyn tightened her grip on the pry bar and slid its thin metal edge beneath the uneven baseboard. For a moment, she couldn't move. The station was silent except for the steady rhythm of rain striking the roof. Static sat only a few feet away, his emerald eyes fixed on the wall as though he already knew what lay behind it. "What were you trying to protect, Dad?" she whispered. The question hung unanswered in the darkness. Finally, she took a deep breath and pressed harder. The old wood groaned before pulling free with a sharp crack that echoed through the empty building. Dust burst into the air, forcing Evelyn to step back, coughing. Behind the baseboard wasn't the concrete foundation she expected. Instead, there was drywall, fresh enough to be different from the surrounding walls. Her pulse quickened. Someone had deliberately sealed this section. And there was only one person who could have done it. Her father. She grabbed a hammer from the toolbox and carefully struck the wall. The first blow produced a dull thud. The second sent a spider web of cracks racing across the surface. The third punch broke straight through. Cold air rushed through the opening. Evelyn froze. There was empty space behind the wall. Not insulation. Not bricks. An actual room. She widened the whole piece by piece until it became large enough to crawl through. Static remained perfectly still beside the entrance, calmly watching every movement, almost as though he had been waiting years for this exact moment. Heart pounding, Evelyn picked up a flashlight. She switched it on. The narrow beam disappeared into darkness. Taking one slow breath, she climbed through the opening. The air inside was cool and astonishingly dry. Unlike the main station, there was almost no dust. Someone had carefully sealed this hidden space from moisture and time. As her flashlight swept across the room, Evelyn stopped breathing. Shelf after shelf stretched into the darkness. Perfectly organized, perfectly preserved. Not stacks of cash, not gold, not jewelry. Something far more extraordinary. Dozens of reel-to-reel tape machines lined the shelves, each one meticulously cleaned and labeled in her father's unmistakable handwriting. Below them sat hundreds of identical metal storage cases. Each carried one of the mysterious codes she had discovered in the broadcast logs. Archive B9, Signal 7, Delta 4, Echo E17. Every code matched. Every mystery suddenly became real. "What is this?" Her voice barely escaped above a whisper. She slowly opened one of the metal cases. Inside rested a perfectly preserved magnetic tape. Nothing else. No explanation. Only another handwritten label. She opened another, then another. Every case contained another carefully catalogued recording. Hundreds of them. Maybe thousands. This wasn't a storage room. It was an archive. An enormous one. As she continued exploring, another shelf caught her attention. Instead of tape reels, dozens of beautifully handcrafted wooden boxes were lined up with astonishing precision. Each one was about the size of a hardcover book. Each contained a small microphone, a simple recording switch, and a tiny antenna unlike anything Evelyn had ever seen. They didn't resemble commercial recording equipment. They looked custom-built. Built by one man? Silas. She picked one up carefully. The craftsmanship was incredible. Every wire had been soldered by hand. Every wooden edge polished smooth. Her father hadn't repaired these. He had invented them. But why? What purpose could hundreds of handmade recorders possibly serve? Questions flooded her mind faster than she could process them. She turned toward another shelf and discovered a thick, leather-bound ledger. Its pages were filled with names. Hundreds of names. Beside each name appeared a matching archive code. Many of them belonged to people Evelyn remembered from childhood. The town's baker, the librarian, the school principal, the volunteer firefighter, the owner of the old hardware store. People who had passed away years ago. Some had been gone for decades. Every name corresponded to one of the tapes surrounding her. Her heartbeat became almost unbearable. Her father hadn't been collecting music. He'd been collecting people. Not their possessions. Not their photographs. Their voices. Suddenly, Arthur's words echoed inside her mind. Every story leaves behind an echo. Silas hadn't been speaking metaphorically. He meant it literally. Evelyn reached for one of the tape machines with trembling hands. After several minutes of careful adjustments, she threaded one of the reels into place exactly as she'd watched her father do countless times as a little girl. The machine clicked. The reels began to spin. For several seconds. Nothing. Only soft static. Then a voice emerged. Weak. Fragile. Old. My name is Walter Hayes, and if someone is listening to this someday, then perhaps my grandchildren will finally know who built the first bridge across Miller Creek. Evelyn gasped. Walter Hayes had died nearly 30 years earlier. She remembered attending his funeral as a child. Yet here he was. His voice, his laughter, his pauses, his breathing, alive again. She sat frozen while the elderly man described his childhood, his first love, the devastating flood that nearly destroyed the town, and the sacrifices ordinary families made to rebuild afterward. It wasn't history from a textbook. It wasn't a newspaper article. It was life itself. Raw, honest, human. When the recording ended, silence returned to the room. But Evelyn was no longer the same person who had crawled through that wall. Tears streamed down her face. She finally understood. Her father had spent decades preserving something the world never thought to value. Not buildings, not money, not land. Memory. He had rescued thousands of lives from being forgotten forever. The abandoned station everyone mocked. The building developers wanted demolished. Contained one of the greatest collections of living history imaginable. At that very moment, a loud rumble of thunder shook the station. The sound snapped Evelyn back to reality. She remembered the demolition notice taped to the front door. The deadline. The developers, Beatrice, if they succeeded. Every recording, every voice, every story hidden inside these walls would be destroyed forever. She looked around the secret archive one more time. Then she made herself a promise. No matter how powerful the people standing against her were, no matter how much money they had, she would protect every single voice her father had saved. Because now she finally understood the truth. She hadn't inherited an abandoned radio station. She had inherited an entire town's soul. And somewhere beyond those walls, people were already preparing to erase it forever. Evelyn barely slept that night. The voices she had heard inside the hidden archive refused to leave her mind. Long after the tape recorder had fallen silent, Walter Hayes's gentle laughter still echoed in her ears. It wasn't simply a recording. It felt as though she had been allowed to step backward through time and meet someone the world had already forgotten. For the first time since her father's death, Evelyn no longer felt alone. She felt responsible. As dawn broke over the marsh, soft golden light filtered through the station's dusty windows. She walked back into the hidden room carrying a notebook, fresh reels, and a steaming cup of coffee she never touched. Instead of searching for more secrets, she began cataloging everything she found. Each shelf revealed another chapter of the town's forgotten history. There were recordings of war veterans describing the day they returned home after World War II. A retired schoolteacher recalled teaching 3 generations of the same families. An elderly midwife told the story of delivering more than 600 babies during her lifetime. Farmers spoke about droughts that nearly destroyed their livelihoods. Young couples described meeting for the first time at county fairs decades earlier. Some laughed. Some cried. Some paused for long stretches, gathering the courage to relive painful memories. None of them imagined that decades later, someone would still be listening. Evelyn realized something extraordinary. Her father had never been collecting voices. He had been preserving humanity. Every recording captured something photographs never could. The trembling in an old man's voice when he remembered losing his brother. The joyful laughter of a grandmother recalling her wedding day. The long silence before someone admitted their greatest regret. These weren't interviews. They were pieces of people's souls. The station suddenly looked different to her. Just days earlier, she had seen broken windows, rusted equipment, and collapsing walls. Now she saw something entirely different. Every cracked floorboard had carried someone who came to tell their story. Every microphone had witnessed moments no history book would ever record. Every inch of the building held invisible fingerprints left by generations of ordinary people whose lives mattered. Her father hadn't spent his life repairing an obsolete radio station. He had built a sanctuary for memory. That realization changed everything. Later that afternoon, Arthur returned as usual, expecting to find Evelyn cleaning. Instead, he found her sitting silently beside one of the reel-to-reel machines. A tape had just finished playing. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Arthur looked at her face. "You found it?" It wasn't a question. Evelyn nodded slowly. "He trusted you with everything." She looked up. "Did you know?" Arthur sighed deeply. I knew there was another room, but I never knew where. Silas told me one day that if the archive was ever discovered before the right time, people would only see its price. Arthur walked toward one of the shelves, gently running his fingers across the metal cases. He wanted someone who would understand its value. His eyes settled on Evelyn. He was waiting for you. She looked around the hidden room once again. I thought he left me nothing. Arthur smiled sadly. He left you the one thing money can't replace. Evelyn lowered her eyes. My stepmother called this place worthless. Arthur shook his head. That's because some people only know how to measure value with dollars. He picked up one of the tapes. Your father measured it in memories. Those words struck Evelyn harder than anything she had heard since her father's death. For weeks, she had mourned the inheritance she believed had been stolen. The house, the savings, the land, the life she thought she deserved. Now none of it seemed important anymore. Even if Beatrice had taken every dollar, she had never truly won. Without realizing it, she had handed Evelyn the greatest treasure Silas possessed. Not because it could make her rich, because it could make sure thousands of lives would never disappear. That evening, Evelyn opened the final drawer of her father's desk. Inside, she found dozens of unopened letters. Most were addressed to the station. Some came from families thanking Silas for recording their parents' stories. Others simply said, "Thank you for listening." One letter caught her attention. It had never been opened. The envelope was yellow with age. Across the front, written in careful handwriting, were the words, "To the person who continues this work." Her heart pounded. It wasn't addressed to her by name, almost as if her father had known someone would eventually sit in this very chair. She carefully unfolded the letter. The handwriting was unmistakably his. If you're reading this, then you've discovered what truly mattered to me. People will tell you these recordings are old voices from forgotten lives. Don't believe them. Every voice here belongs to someone who loved, sacrificed, dreamed, failed, forgave, and hoped just as we do today. A town doesn't disappear when its buildings fall. It disappears when no one remembers the people who built them. Protect these stories. Someday the world will need them more than it realizes. By the time Evelyn reached the final line, tears blurred the page. She carefully folded the letter and placed it against her heart. For weeks, she had searched for answers about why her father had left her an abandoned station. Now she understood. He hadn't abandoned her at all. He had trusted her. As the sun disappeared beyond the marsh, Evelyn climbed the narrow staircase leading to the roof. The rusted broadcast tower stretched high into the darkening sky. For years, the entire town had looked at it as an ugly relic. Now she saw something entirely different. It wasn't merely steel. It was a monument. Every bolt represented another year her father refused to let the town forget itself. Every cable carried decades of unseen devotion. Every beam stood because one man believed that ordinary lives deserved to be remembered. She closed her eyes as the evening wind swept across the marsh. The grief that had consumed her since her father's funeral was still there, but it no longer felt empty. It had transformed into purpose. She finally understood why Silas never fought to become wealthy, why he spent countless nights alone inside the station, why he never cared that people laughed at him. He wasn't trying to save a radio station. He was trying to save time itself. Far below, headlights appeared on the distant road leading toward the property. Several large trucks slowed near the entrance before continuing past. Construction surveyors, measuring, planning, preparing. The developers hadn't given up. They still believed this was nothing more than abandoned land waiting to become another shopping center. They had absolutely no idea what rested behind those walls. Evelyn watched the vehicles disappear into the distance. Then she looked back toward the station. This place no longer belonged only to her father. It belonged to every voice hidden inside it. And for the first time in her life, she knew exactly what she had to do. She wasn't going to protect an old building. She was going to defend the memory of an entire town, no matter what it cost. The next morning, Evelyn arrived at the station before sunrise. For the first time since inheriting the property, she didn't unlock the front door with uncertainty. She unlocked it with purpose. Everything had changed. Just days ago, she believed she was fighting to save the last reminder of her father. Now she understood she was protecting something far greater. She was protecting hundreds of voices that no one else even knew still existed. But purpose alone wouldn't stop a demolition crew. She needed a plan. She walked into the hidden archive carrying a notebook and began making a list. Every tape had to be cataloged. Every recording had to be preserved. Every story had to survive, even if the building didn't. The task felt overwhelming. There were hundreds of reels, possibly thousands, years of work, maybe decades. Still, she refused to let fear win. One voice at a time, one story at a time. That was enough. Arthur arrived later that morning carrying his usual thermos of coffee. Before he could speak, Evelyn handed him one of the recordings. Listen. He threaded the tape into the machine without asking questions. A woman's gentle voice filled the room. She described opening the town's first public library nearly 60 years earlier. She laughed while remembering children running between the bookshelves with muddy shoes, hiding comic books inside history texts, and believing every book contained an adventure waiting just for them. Arthur closed his eyes. When the tape ended, he quietly wiped tears from his face. I knew her, he whispered. She taught me how to read. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Arthur looked around the hidden archive. This changes everything. Evelyn nodded. It has to. No, Arthur corrected gently. It will. He leaned forward. People won't ignore this once they hear it. She wasn't convinced. Well, what if they don't care? Arthur smiled. They won't be listening to history. They'll be listening to the people they loved. That afternoon, Arthur returned with an old desktop computer, 2 external hard drives, and several boxes filled with audio equipment. I've been saving these. He grinned. Guess I finally found the right reason. Together they spent hours connecting cables, cleaning tape heads, and testing software capable of converting the fragile analog recordings into digital files. The process was painfully slow. Every tape had to be cleaned, every recording monitored. Some reels were nearly 50 years old. One mistake could destroy a voice forever. Evelyn sat in front of the computer wearing headphones while another recording transferred. An elderly farmer described teaching his grandson how to plant corn by watching birds instead of calendars. His voice occasionally cracked with emotion. At one point he laughed so hard he began coughing. Evelyn smiled without realizing it. These weren't museum pieces. These were conversations, living memories. The people speaking had never imagined strangers would someday treasure their ordinary lives. Yet that was exactly what made them extraordinary. By the third day, something unexpected began happening. People started showing up, not because Evelyn had invited them, because Arthur had quietly told a few trusted friends what had been discovered. The first visitor was Mrs. Donnelly, an 82-year-old retired nurse. She stood nervously at the doorway, holding a homemade apple pie. I heard, she began softly. I heard Silas saved voices. Evelyn nodded. Mrs. Donnelly hesitated before asking. My husband. He recorded something here years ago. I've forgotten what his laugh sounded like. Do you think... Her voice broke. Do you think it's still here? Evelyn searched the handwritten ledger. After several minutes, she found his name. Archive C14. With trembling hands, she placed the tape onto the recorder. The room filled with silence. Then, a deep, joyful laugh echoed through the station. Mrs. Donnelly covered her mouth. Tears poured down her cheeks. Oh, Harold, she whispered. I thought I'd never hear you again. She reached toward the speaker as if she could somehow touch him one last time. For nearly an hour, she sat listening while her late husband spoke about their first date, raising their children, and the tiny farmhouse they built together with almost no money. When the recording ended, she hugged Evelyn without saying a word. No thank you could have been enough. News spread quietly across town. Not through newspapers, not through television, through conversations, over coffee, at a church, in grocery store aisles. One family told another, then another. People began arriving every day. Some carried photographs. Others brought old letters. Many simply wanted to ask one question. Do you have my father's voice? My grandmother. My brother. Sometimes Evelyn found the recording. Sometimes she didn't. But whenever she did, the reaction was always the same. Disbelief. Then tears. Then gratitude. The station slowly transformed. It no longer felt abandoned. It felt alive. The empty parking lot filled with cars. Fresh flowers appeared beside the front entrance. Someone repaired the broken fence without asking permission. Another volunteer fixed leaking pipes. The local bakery began dropping off fresh pastries every morning. A retired electrician offered to inspect the building free of charge. No one asked for payment. No one expected recognition. They simply wanted to help. Not because of the building, because of what the building protected. One afternoon, while organizing another shelf, Evelyn noticed something remarkable. The newest recordings were nearly 15 years old. Nothing had been added after her father's illness became serious. She stared at the empty recorder sitting on the table. Then a thought crossed her mind. Why should the archive end with him? Her father hadn't created a museum. He had created a living collection. The purpose wasn't only to preserve the past. It was to preserve every generation before their stories disappeared. That evening, she carried one of Silas's handcrafted recording boxes into the main room. She carefully cleaned the microphone, replaced its batteries, tested the controls. Then she placed a handwritten sign beside it. Tell your story. Someone will need it someday. Arthur looked at the sign and smiled. I think Silas would approve. The following morning, before anyone else arrived, Mrs. Donnelly quietly walked over to the recorder. She hesitated for a long moment before pressing the red button. My name is Margaret Donnelly. She began. If my grandchildren are listening to this someday, I want them to know how deeply their grandfather loved them. Evelyn stood in the doorway, listening. Her eyes filled with tears. At that moment, she finally understood. The archive wasn't just her father's legacy anymore. It had become the town's heartbeat. A bridge connecting generations that would never meet. For the first time since Silas passed away, Evelyn didn't see herself as the caretaker of something that was ending. She saw herself as the beginning of something entirely new. The voices of the past had been saved. Now it was time to make sure the voices of the future would never be lost. And although hope was finally beginning to return to the old station, Evelyn knew the greatest challenge still lay ahead. The developers hadn't abandoned their plans. They were simply waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when they did, she would have to prove that memories could be more powerful than money. The station no longer echoed with silence. Every morning, before the sun rose above the marsh, Evelyn unlocked the front door to find someone already waiting. Sometimes it was an elderly couple carrying faded photographs. Sometimes it was a grandson hoping to hear the voice of a grandfather he had never met. Other days, it was a volunteer arriving with a toolbox, a paintbrush, or simply a pot of fresh coffee. The building that had once been abandoned was beginning to breathe again. And so was Evelyn. Only a few weeks earlier, she had walked through those same doors burdened by grief, convinced that life had stripped away everything she loved. She had seen herself as a victim, a young woman cheated out of her inheritance and left with nothing but a crumbling radio station. Now, every voice she restored reminded her that her father had never left her empty-handed. He had entrusted her with something infinitely greater than wealth. He had entrusted her with purpose. The restoration of the archive became more than a project. It became a mission. Every evening, Evelyn carefully cleaned another reel before transferring it into digital form. Some recordings were nearly impossible to recover. The magnetic tape had begun to deteriorate after decades of storage. Hours were spent repairing damaged audio, removing static, balancing volume levels, and documenting every speaker's name. The work demanded extraordinary patience. But she never complained, because every successful restoration felt like bringing someone back to life. One afternoon, she recovered the recording of a young firefighter describing the night he rescued a family trapped inside a burning farmhouse. His confidence filled the room. His laughter was contagious. When the tape ended, Arthur quietly smiled. He never told anyone he was terrified. Evelyn looked surprised. He sounded fearless. Arthur nodded. That's because courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to act despite it. The words lingered with her. Without realizing it, they described her own journey. As the weeks passed, Evelyn noticed something changing inside herself. She no longer entered the hidden archive looking for clues. She entered looking for people. Every voice introduced her to someone whose life had shaped the town. She laughed with them. She mourned with them. She celebrated their victories and carried their regrets. Little by little, her own grief became lighter, not because she missed her father less, but because she finally understood why he had dedicated his life to this place. Silas had spent decades reminding people that ordinary lives mattered. Now Evelyn was doing the same. One afternoon, a teenage boy named Liam wandered into the station. He couldn't have been more than 16. Headphones hung around his neck, and his attention rarely drifted away from the phone in his hand. "My mom made me come," he admitted. "She said my great-grandfather recorded something here." Evelyn smiled. "I think I know exactly where to find it." A few minutes later, she started the tape. An elderly man's warm voice filled the room. "My name is George Walker. I've worked these fields since I was 12 years old. I never became famous. I never became rich. But every harvest fed another family." Liam barely looked up. Then the recording continued. "If you're one of my grandchildren listening someday, I hope you remember that success isn't measured by how many people know your name. It's measured by how many people are better because you lived." The teenager slowly lowered his phone. For the next 40 minutes, he never touched it again. When the recording finished, he sat silently staring at the machine. "I never met him," he whispered. "It feels like I just did." As he walked toward the door, he paused. "Do you need volunteers here?" Evelyn smiled. "We always do." The next Saturday, Liam returned with 3 friends. The week after that, they brought more. Young people who had never cared about local history suddenly found themselves repairing shelves, organizing tapes, scanning photographs, and building the archive's website. For the first time in decades, generations who rarely spoke to one another were working side by side. Silas's dream was growing beyond anything he could have imagined. Meanwhile, the pressure from the developers continued. Surveyors appeared along the property line almost every week. Letters from attorneys arrived demanding inspections, permits, and compliance reports. Anonymous complaints were filed with the town, accusing the station of violating safety codes. The message was unmistakable. Someone wanted Evelyn to give up. Months earlier, those tactics would have terrified her. Now they barely slowed her down. Every threat only strengthened her resolve. Whenever fear crept back into her mind, she walked into the archive and played another recording. The voices reminded her why she couldn't surrender. Not anymore. She wasn't fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who could no longer speak. One rainy evening, while reviewing another collection of tapes, Evelyn found a recording she had somehow overlooked. The label simply read, "Silas Harper." Her hands froze. She had spent weeks listening to hundreds of strangers, but she had never heard her father's own story. With trembling fingers, she threaded the reel into the recorder. The machine hummed softly. Then his familiar voice filled the room. If you're hearing this, then I suppose you finally found the archive. Evelyn closed her eyes. It felt as though he were sitting across the room. I've often wondered whether this work would end with me. I hoped it wouldn't. But hope isn't enough. So if you're listening, I thank you. Not for saving the recordings, for believing that every ordinary life deserves to be remembered. His voice paused. Then came a quiet laugh she hadn't heard since childhood. I know people think I'm stubborn. They're probably right. But one day someone will try to convince you that these stories have no value. They'll tell you progress requires sacrifice. They'll offer you money. They'll promise you a better future. When that day comes, remember this: a future built by forgetting its past never lasts. The recording ended with a few seconds of silence. Then one final sentence. I'm proud of you, Buitsos. Whether you know it yet or not. Evelyn could no longer hold back her tears. For several minutes she simply sat there, letting the silence settle around her. She realized something profound. She had spent her entire life trying to earn her father's approval, yet he had already given it. Long before she ever discovered the archive, long before she believed she was strong enough, that night Evelyn walked outside and stood beneath the towering broadcast mast. The wind gently moved through the rusted steel above her, producing a soft, metallic hum that reminded her of distant radio signals. She looked toward the town lights glowing on the horizon. Once, she had believed this station was the last chapter of her father's story. Now she understood it was only the beginning of her own. She was no longer the grieving daughter searching for what had been lost. She had become the guardian of countless voices, a storyteller, a leader, a bridge between generations. And as she stood beneath the tower, she sensed that the greatest test was still approaching. Because somewhere across town, the people determined to destroy everything her father had built were preparing one final move. This time, they wouldn't simply threaten the station. They would try to erase its future forever. The day of the town council meeting arrived beneath a gray autumn sky. By sunrise, Evelyn was already standing inside the station, staring at the shelves that had transformed her life. Hundreds of carefully labeled tapes surrounded her, each containing a voice that had once feared being forgotten. She ran her fingertips across the nearest metal case. "This is for all of you," she whispered. One by one, she selected several recordings and placed them carefully inside a worn leather bag. These weren't the oldest tapes, nor the rarest. They were the ones that told the story of the town itself. A bricklayer who helped build Main Street. A nurse who cared for generations of families. A firefighter who risked his life without expecting recognition. A farmer who believed every harvest was an act of hope. And one final recording. Her father's. Arthur watched quietly as she packed the last reel. "You don't need to convince everyone," he said softly. "You only need to remind them who they are." Evelyn nodded. For weeks she had worried about winning an argument. Now she understood. She wasn't going to fight with statistics. She wasn't going to challenge blueprints or financial projections. She was going to let the voices speak for themselves. The council chamber was already crowded when Evelyn arrived. Developers sat confidently in tailored suits, their expensive presentation boards lined against the wall. Croft greeted council members with practiced smiles and firm handshakes. To him, today's vote was little more than a formality. The abandoned station would finally disappear. A new shopping center would take its place. Progress. Profit. Opportunity. That was the story he intended to sell. Beatrice sat beside him, perfectly composed. She barely acknowledged Evelyn as she entered. To her, the young woman carrying an old tape recorder looked hopelessly outmatched. Neither of them noticed the growing number of townspeople quietly filling the back rows. Arthur arrived. Then Mrs. Donnelly? Liam and his friends. the retired electrician, the librarian's daughter, the baker, the volunteer firefighters. Families Evelyn had met over the past several weeks continued entering until every seat had been filled. No one spoke. They simply waited. The meeting began exactly as Croft expected. Charts, economic forecasts, projected tax revenue, employment statistics, architectural renderings. Every slide promised a brighter future. Every sentence described the radio station as an abandoned liability standing in the way of progress. When Croft finished, polite applause echoed through the room. The council chairman adjusted his glasses. "Before we vote," he announced, "does anyone wish to speak?" Evelyn stood. "I do." She carried only a small reel-to-reel recorder. No charts, no legal documents, no prepared speech. Several council members exchanged skeptical looks. The chairman sighed. "You have 5 minutes." She walked slowly to the podium. Instead of looking at the council, she looked toward the audience, toward the families whose lives filled the archive. "My father spent 30 years listening," she began quietly. "Today, I hope you'll spend 5 minutes doing the same." Without another word, she pressed the play button. The room filled with the gentle crackle of old magnetic tape. Then came a familiar elderly voice. "I laid every brick on Main Street with these hands. Ko, and every evening I walked home proud because I knew my children would grow up in something worth building." Silence spread across the chamber. Another voice followed. A schoolteacher recalled comforting frightened children during the blizzard of 1967. A firefighter described carrying a little girl through smoke-filled hallways. A nurse spoke about holding the hands of strangers who had no family beside them in their final moments. No one moved. The room no longer felt like a government meeting. It felt like a family remembering itself. Then Evelyn played the final recording. Her father's voice. "If someone tells you these stories have no value, ask them what price they would place on hearing their mother's laughter one more time." The words settled over the room like falling snow. No one breathed. No one looked away. Even Croft stared silently at the recorder. For the first time since Evelyn had met him, confidence disappeared from his face. She looked directly at the council. "You've been asked to approve the destruction of this building." She paused. "But that building isn't made of concrete. It's made of people. If you tear it down, you won't simply erase a station. You'll erase every voice still waiting to be heard." An elderly man slowly stood from the audience. "My father is on one of those tapes." Another woman rose. "So is my mother." Then another. "And my grandfather." Within seconds, people throughout the chamber were standing. Not in protest. In recognition. They weren't defending a building anymore. They were defending their own families. Their own history. Their own identities. The atmosphere shifted completely. Council members looked around the room, realizing they were no longer deciding the future of an abandoned property. They were deciding whether their community deserved to remember itself. The chairman quietly removed his glasses. For several long moments, he simply sat in silence. Finally, he spoke. "I visited that station as a boy." His voice trembled. "My father used to volunteer there. I had forgotten." He looked toward Evelyn. "Thank you." For helping us remember." The vote that followed was unanimous. The demolition order was permanently revoked. The property received immediate protection as a historic cultural archive. A preservation committee was established before the meeting even ended. Volunteers offered funding. Local businesses pledged equipment. Teachers proposed educational programs for local schools. University historians requested partnerships. Audio preservation experts volunteered their expertise. Within a single afternoon, the forgotten station became the beating heart of the entire community. Not because anyone had forced them, because they finally understood what had almost been lost. Months later, the station looked completely different. Fresh paint covered the once faded walls. The roof no longer leaked. New recording equipment stood beside Silas's original machines. Young volunteers worked alongside retirees every weekend. Children wandered through exhibits, laughing as they listened to stories recorded decades before they were born. The building had become more than an archive. It had become a place where generations met, where strangers became neighbors, where memories became gifts instead of grief. Above the entrance hung a simple wooden sign, the Harper Echo Archive. Every voice matters. One quiet afternoon, Evelyn stood alone inside the restored broadcast room. The golden afternoon sunlight streamed through spotless windows, illuminating the old console where her father had spent so many nights. The little reel-to-reel recorder sat beside her. She pressed the record button. A small red light flickered on. She smiled. "My name is Evelyn Harper." She paused, looking around the room that had once felt so empty. "If you're listening to this many years from now, I hope you know something my father spent his entire life trying to teach me. People leave this world, but love doesn't. As long as someone remembers your story, well, a part of you never truly disappears." She looked toward the old broadcast tower outside the window. The same tower everyone once called worthless. Now it stood as a symbol of hope, rising proudly above the town, carrying not radio signals, but the enduring promise that no ordinary life would ever be forgotten again. As the seasons changed, life at the Harper Echo Archive settled into a peaceful rhythm. Every week, new visitors walked through its doors carrying memories they feared would disappear forever. Some brought old photographs tucked inside worn envelopes. Others carried handwritten letters, wedding albums, military medals, or family Bibles filled with names dating back generations. But almost everyone carried the same fear. What happens when no one is left who remembers? Evelyn had once asked herself that very question. Now, she finally knew the answer. Memories don't survive because time is kind. They survive because someone chooses to protect them. That had been her father's greatest lesson all along. He never believed ordinary people lived ordinary lives. To him, every person carried a story worth preserving. Every laugh mattered. Every sacrifice mattered. Every act of kindness mattered. Not because history books would remember them, but because someone, somewhere, would someday need those stories to understand where they came from. Looking back, Evelyn realized that losing her inheritance had never been the tragedy she thought it was. If she had inherited the house, the money, or the land, she might never have stepped inside the abandoned station. She might never have discovered the hidden archive. She might never have understood her father's true purpose. Sometimes life has a strange way of disguising its greatest blessings as heartbreaking losses. The things we fight hardest to hold on to are not always the things we truly need. And the things we believe we've lost often make room for something far more meaningful to be found. The people who tried to destroy the station measured value in dollars. Silas measured value in lives. One measurement fades with time. The other grows stronger with every generation. That is why the archive became more than a building. It became proof that love can outlive death. That kindness can outlive the people who gave it. That voices can continue guiding hearts long after they have fallen silent. Perhaps the greatest inheritance any of us can leave behind isn't wealth. It isn't property. It isn't success. It's the way we make people feel while we're here and the stories they continue telling after we're gone. Because in the end, no one is remembered for the size of their bank account. They are remembered for the lives they touched, for the hope they gave, for the love they shared, and for the memories they refused to let fade away. If this story has reminded you of someone you love, a parent, a grandparent, a lifelong friend, or someone whose voice you wish you could hear just one more time, don't wait. Ask them about their life. Record their stories. Listen a little longer. One day, Those ordinary conversations may become the most extraordinary gift your family will ever receive. Because memories are fragile, but once they're preserved, they can inspire generations. Call to action. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who still has a parent, grandparent, or loved one they can sit beside today. You never know whose story could become tomorrow's greatest treasure. And if you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story about hope, resilience, and the extraordinary power hidden inside ordinary lives. Finally, I'd love to hear from you. What is one story from someone you love that you never want to forget? Share it in the comments below. Your memory might inspire someone else to preserve the voices that matter most before they become echoes.